Hi, KIB parents. Welcome to the Maximinds Mental Health Care webinar series. I'm really looking forward to the next 8 weeks with you where we explore topics relating to mental health, mental illness, and also really practical strategies that you can take away to help your children to be mentally healthy and well. So just to recap, this is the planned 8 webinars that we have upcoming. So to start with today, we're looking at mental health. Next week, then we'll look at mental illness, go through looking at warning signs for you to look out for, really getting to know your child and understand their strengths, interests, and values, and then also understanding how you can connect with them. Also developing your own sense of self-awareness, looking at prevention techniques and methods that can help, and also where to go for extra support and help. So to get started with today, Mental Health 101, and we'll get straight into the introduction. So these are the sorts of things that I'm hoping that you'll come away with today and hopefully you're interested in. So firstly, what is mental health? What causes positive mental health? Why is mental health important? And how do we promote mental health in your child? Further to that, we've broken it up into a number of sections for today that you can flick through, starting with introduction, then the definitions, causes, importance, and the how component is 3 different dimensions that we think about it in terms of Maximinds as to how to help your child if they're in control, if they're in the present moment, and also if they're in touch with reality. And what does that really look like, and what are the practical strategies that you can help them to feel those things in order to help with their mental well-being? And then we'll close with a summary, and I'll refer you to some resources as well. So just to get into it, if you wouldn't mind please answering 2 quick questions for me. It's just to help gauge where your understanding's at now, which can also help you to self-reflect and understand hopefully what you come away with from today and what you've learnt, and also that we can use this feedback to help improve the coming webinars and focusing on areas that might be gaps for you. So I'll just give you 30 seconds to do that, please. Okay, so thank you for completing that. Now let's get straight into what are the definitions of mental health and well-being, and how are they firstly defined according to the World Health Organization. I'll just give you a moment to read this. As you can see from the yellow highlights, these are factors that contribute to mental health and well-being, and these are topics that we will be exploring in the coming webinars. In terms of the red highlights, these are more of the outcomes or benefits of having mental health and well-being, which go above and beyond, I think, just the immediate time that the children are in now, but look into how they end up contributing and shaping the world. And the pink highlight is something interesting to note, that mental health is in fact a basic human right. And I think we'll come back to that, but that's something to keep in mind as well. How does Kinkoppel Rose Bay define mental health and well-being? As you would be familiar with, they use the Self Plus Wellbeing Framework, which is social, emotional learning to flourish, and that's underpinned by 6 key positive psychology elements, including positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, accomplishment, and health. Also, on the right-hand side, they have this framework which helps develop their understanding self and beyond, that goes increasingly throughout their schooling experience to be more focused ultimately on how do they think of themselves and understand themselves in relation to the world and broader than themselves, which I think just shows in line with what we just read about with the World Health Organization, what KIB is doing, and the focus on how are our students and children placed in themselves, and how do they have well-being for themselves, but also how do they fit in the broader world, which I think is right on point with good for them and their mental well-being. And how do we define mental health at Maximinds? So over the years of research and also thousands of hours of working with students and psychotherapy, we've come up with this three-part model, which is three dimensions, I think, that are most important for mental well-being. And the intersection between all of those is when you really have children that are able to thrive. So there's three dimensions: person, time, and space dimension. So firstly, in terms of the person dimension, is having a sense of control and being in control, having that sense of agency, autonomy, sense of empowerment is key. In terms of the time dimension, it's being in the present moment. So what's happening in that moment, in that exact space and time, which is fundamental to being present with effective what's right there in front of them, rather than ruminating on the past and also worrying about the future. And that third element of the third dimension, space, is really about how to help them be in touch with reality. And this one in particular as well, I think, is about what's actually happening around them in their world, what's actually legitimately going on rather than what's been distorted, is very important. And we'll explore more about these and how you can help your children to put these in practice a bit later on in this session. But just thought I'd introduce that definition of mental health and well-being that we think of and use every day. So to start with, what are the causes of mental health and well-being? This is probably not new to you. Just to recap, that it's caused ultimately by nature, which is things like genetic predisposition, of course, you as parents, your biology and genetics, but also those of your parents, and also neurobiological factors. So the way in which our brains and individually can be formed, and how can they be more likely to be mentally well versus not, which is more inherited. On the other side is, of course, nurture. And that is, again, a huge role for you as parents as to how you're fostering those environments at home, how are the environments also at school impacting children and their mental well-being, who are their peers, what sorts of places and people and things do they spend their time around. And most importantly, I think that firstly, it's both of these, a combination of both of these, but really want to emphasize, and true to having growth mindsets, and that's what we're wanting to promote, is focusing on this nurture element, which is where you can have a real impact. And I do think this has a huge potential for helping children with mental well-being, is really thinking about how can we foster that and change the environment and things like that, and give them strategies and tools. So big focus on nurture. Now to the importance of mental health. I think it can get there's a bit of and now to the importance of mental health and well-being. I think there is some underlying stigma that it's a bit nice to have, it's a bit woo-woo sometimes, it's a luxury rather than a priority. And those sorts of comments I have heard over the years, and things to that effect I will just pop up on the screen. So these are some comments or various interpretations of what I've heard from parents, and I do think that this is not uncommon. That obviously marks are a priority, and that makes sense because our children are studying and at school, and that is a big emphasis. We'll look at how that's could be potentially challenged shortly. We never had self-care, and why do they need it? Again, this more stigma and stereotype around, well, this is a nice to have, and why can't I just get on with it? And self-care, just get going, and feels a bit potentially sometimes self-indulgent in this generation, that it's like a right rather than something that they shouldn't be doing. What do they have to worry about? So that is an interesting one as well, given we have, I'm going to show you a hierarchy. We do have research that suggests that there's greater rates of mental illness actually more in Western countries rather than Eastern, because ironically, if you have everything, you're striving for something, what's next? And I'll show you as to why that's actually having a negative impact on our children's mental health. And of course, there's things like the worries, which are increasingly, I think, today, things like COVID, things like climate change, those sorts of things can sit there and niggle at them in the back of their minds and come out in different ways. So they're just a few things to think about. Here's another thought, that we all take our children to the doctor for their physical health. So what are we doing for their mental health? And again, I think this just goes back to society, which says, yes, we all need doctors, and that's very important for our bodies. But then what are we doing for our arguably most important organ, our brain, and what are we doing to look after that? So I'm a big advocate for, if we're having doctors, then what are we doing for our minds? Another thing I want to draw back to is the fact that the World Health Organization defined mental health as a basic human right. So I guess this makes it pretty clear as to why it's important. So if they're thinking it's a fundamental right, then that's probably something just to keep in mind as to how important it is. Beyond just being a right, I also want to talk to you about how it's a need. And this is the hierarchy I mentioned just before. It's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with it, but basically what it says is that as you go through life, you're able to develop a hierarchy of needs, starting with physiological needs, basics like food, water, shelter, clothing, moving up to safety. So that's more having the security of a home, the protection, law and order, and things like that. Then social needs, relationships, friendships, sense of belonging, esteem, having more of that sense of achievement, mastery, competence, and then ultimately self-actualization needs, which is, what is my role in this world? What's the meaning? What's my purpose? As you can see by the area of each of the levels, self-actualization is believed to be only attained by a small percentage of the population. Our girls and your children, I would think, would sit in that higher order needs, because they already have, again, the luxury of having those physiological needs, safety needs, and social needs met. So that's where I think that as you try and strive for higher things, and this push for success and mastery and esteem and what's my meaning, as I mentioned, a smaller fraction can get there, and yet that's what the emphasis is always on, is to what's next, how do we achieve and strive. So I think that's why that mental health and well-being is very important, for particularly for those that are in privileged backgrounds in some ways, because they've already met those basic needs, and that's the fortunate thing of that. But the downside is that higher rates of mental illness as well. I guess that also extends on, well, what is the ultimate goal? And as we saw before, one of the quotes being, I'm more concerned with their marks. I think that is definitely a general perception that marks are very important. Obviously, academic success, particularly in a great school like King Koppel, is important. And there is the perception that under these things are on the one hand, on the nature debate is the IQ, that general smarts, and then also the nurture is that hard work and perseverance, and that's how you get to the top. So you've either got IQ and or hard work. But as we know, and as research shows, there's a lot more that goes under that to get to the top. So things like healthy eating, physical exercise, and sleep hygiene are all things, and I think of this as like a really important basic trio for you parents to think about for children, your child, and thinking about mental health and well-being. Those three things are key, also contributes massively to mental health. And then also, obviously, under that, we've got emotional regulation, self-confidence, and that esteem we just looked at as a higher order need, grit and resilience, social activities, and there's obviously a plethora of other factors that also go into mental health and well-being. But just to reiterate that this is part of the full picture of how to achieve and get to the top. And that is why very deliberately the Maximinds logo has these building blocks. And that's the way I often speak to children about it, which is you don't get to the top by just having really just by just studying all the time 24/7. It's just not going to work. And likewise, of course, you can't just do it if you just have the hard work, but without, and to the point that you're burning yourself out. All these underlying basic building blocks are the really key pillars. And it's not just from my experience that I've found this. There was a 2011 meta-analysis on 300,000 students, some of which went through a social and emotional learning program similar to KIB's Self Plus, and some of them that didn't go through this program. And they found that those who went through the program had 11 percentage points higher at the end of that experience rather than those who didn't. So again, just to reiterate, it's not just a nice to have, it's actually helping their academics if that is ultimately the goal. But just good to call out that these are the sort of things that are helping to get them to the top of their goals and desires. As a reminder, the World Health Organization mentioned these key things and factors as almost outcomes of mental health and well-being, and I wanted to reiterate that these are the benefits that are above and beyond just the school experience. So things like better decision making and helping then our children to have mental well-being in order to make better decisions for their post secondary and therefore maybe tertiary education decisions, which jobs to take and not, things like that. Healthier relationships. Mental health is also related to having fewer divorces and greater marital satisfaction, which is obviously good for our girls and later on. Better social contributors, as we saw, again, the personal, community and socioeconomic development contributions that those that have greater mental health are more likely to contribute to. And if that's not all enough reasons as to why mental health and wellbeing is important, there are studies that show the link between mental health and wellbeing and higher income 15 years later from school. So that's all, I think, collectively some reasons. Not only is mental health and wellbeing a fundamental right, it's a higher order need, and I think particularly a need that our girls and Key Couple girls strive for. It is also good for their ATARs and their academics, and it's good for their life. So hopefully now we see why it's important. And so how do we promote mental health and well-being in our children? We will explore this in greater depth in these 4 webinars that are coming up. So key things are helping to fully understand your children by focusing and learning about their strengths, interests, and values. Also, developing really strong connections with them, and some techniques that we use as psychologists are things like listening, validating, and responding. And I'll show you 1-minute strategies as to how you can do that. Self-awareness, also understanding your own strengths, interests, and values, but also your parenting styles and how that can impact positively on your child as a role model. and also therefore impacting their mental health and well-being. And then some prevention strategies as to how to prevent mental illness from creeping up, and basic things like setting routines and boundaries, and again, how practically to do that. So I'd like to remind you of the definition of mental health according to Maximize, which is about having a sense of control, presence, and reality. So to start with, how do we help our children to have more of a sense of control and autonomy over what they get to decide, what sorts of foods they get to eat, how and when they get to study, what subjects they even choose? All those sorts of things are things that you can start thinking about and to help your child have a sense of control. I would encourage you to think about other sorts of things that might be on a day-to-day basis as well, to encourage them to feel like they have got a sense of control, even deciding what to have for dinner or deciding where they go to, which restaurants the family goes to, or things like that. So giving them a sense of control is very important, as we know, for mental well-being. A couple of techniques that we have, and I'll talk you through, just to highlight first, I guess, that purple one there, the breathing technique. Something as basic as helping them to realize they're in control of their own breath and heart rate. So as we know, breathing out reduces the oxygen in our body, and that also reduces heart rate. So by taking big breaths out, then they're able to reduce their oxygen and reduce their heart rate and calm themselves down when they're having moments of feeling overwhelmed or stressed or anxious and things like that. And it's a good way to help show them just the power they have even of controlling their own body. Another technique that I will show you as well is around the control circle. And this is an activity that I would suggest that you could give them. I'll just play it for you.
Mental well-being is about recognizing what is within our control. As parents, you can guide your children to create a control circle. You can start by drawing a circle and have them identify and write down what is within their control inside the circle and what is outside their control outside of the circle. By focusing their energy on what they can control and accepting what is beyond their control, children can experience a greater sense of autonomy and promote their mental well-being.
And in addition to having video strategies like this, we also have activities which are able to be downloaded. And the reason for this is because it goes back to helping with that general sense of being in reality and being rational. When things are on the paper, they're a lot more rational, particularly children, because you can see them and they take away some of all that subjectivity, the emotional, the emotional and feelings that go with it, and make it more objective. So that's the technique here, is on paper for the control circle. So if you do want to do an activity like that, this is something, for example, you could get them to just regroup, take a moment to draw that out. Another technique that we like to help children to encourage their sense of control with is a simple to do, but then also to-da list. So we're often focused on what we have to do, and obviously all familiar with to-do lists, but the to-da is equally important, like ta-da, like what have I achieved today? And that's obviously equally important, as we've explored, about that hierarchy of needs. And because of this constant feeling like they're on this journey to try and self-actualize and find out what are they, meant to be, what's their meaning and purpose, stopping and reflecting what have they actually achieved on a day-to-day basis really helps with those higher order self-esteem and self-actualization needs. So the to-do could be 3 little things to do, for example, that night after dinner. Just pick 3 things you want to finish off in the next hour before bed. And then encourage them to do that. And then just before bed, for example, it might be, what have they achieved? Even if they didn't do those specific things, maybe they did something else. So it's important to note that we don't necessarily always get through our to-do list, and we're probably all aware of this, that you end up getting diverted and doing other things, but you've still done something. It wasn't necessarily on that initial to-do list. So I think it still gives them a sense of achievement, even if it's not ticking off that arbitrary to-do list. So that's another tool that I would suggest giving to students to help them again feel a bit more in control when they're not feeling as well that Good. So the second element and dimension that we talk about is having a sense of presence and being in the present moment. So again, how can you do this with your child and help them to feel more in the present? Fundamentally, it's really about helping them to realize what's happening right now in this moment. And again, to that example I just gave, let's not, with the to do and to da, let's not think about what do we have to do before now and getting your ATAR. What actually can be achieved right now in this next hour, even maybe in the day, but without catastrophizing to thinking, well, what do I have to do for HSC trials down the track? Simplistically, with research suggests that those that focus on the past typically have more symptoms like depression, and at a high level, again, to generalize, those that worry about the future, typically that more maps onto things like anxiety. So another reason why being in the present moment is important. But of course, how does this actually happen? The most useful and the single best mental health technique that I can emphasize is meditation and mindfulness. And I know this feels like it gets a lot of airtime, but the reason why it's so important is because it actually doesn't just help them to be in the present moment, it also helps them to feel a sense of control and feel when they do things like body scans, which I'll show you in a second, and also helps with that being in touch with reality and what's happening, what's actually happening, not what's distorted. So if there was one single technique and one takeaway is if you can do a daily mindfulness meditation with your child or encourage them to do so, and there is a 50-second one on Maximinds, and I'll show you one now. You could even use your own voice, which is probably more comforting and familiar to them. That is the most important thing. And the reason I think there is such a aversion to mindfulness is because we're not used to being told to sit in the present moment and focus on what's actually happening in that moment in your mind. We're often thinking what happened today or what's going to happen tomorrow, and it's about unlearning those sorts of fixations on the past and present and refocusing on the current moment, which is a skill that takes practice over time. But because our brains, and particularly children's brains, are very neuroplastic, so they do evolve and adapt over time, it does get easier and it's worth it, and it's the single best tool I can suggest. So I'm going to show you this one.
As parents, you can guide your children in practicing mindfulness meditation. Teach them to close their eyes and focus on their thoughts, emotions, and bodily sensations. Encourage them to acknowledge these experiences without judgment or attachment. Guide them through a body scan where they pay attention to different parts of their body, relaxing each area as they go. Then prompt them to bring their awareness back to the present moment by opening their eyes and engaging their senses. Encourage them to notice what they see, hear, touch, and smell in their environment. Regular mindfulness meditation practice helps children develop a sense of self-awareness, manage stress, and cultivate mental well-being.
So another technique that is on paper, more of a downloadable activity, is just a simple thing like this. What is happening right now? And getting them to write it down to be more in the present moment. Again, it seems quite simple, and it really is, but that's the benefit of it, which is helping them to objectively see on the paper what's happening now. This, by virtue of picking up the pen and a piece of paper or doing it digitally, they can still focus on what's in front of them, which is obviously very good for mental well-being. And the third dimension that we think of mental health in terms of is reality. So how do we help children to be more in touch with reality? This is obviously a space dimension, so it's about what's happening actually in the world, what's actually happening rather than what's perceived to be happening. And we'll explore that concept much more when we talk about mental illness next week, which is around being out of touch with reality and having more of those irrational, distorted thoughts. So, of course, greater sense of being in reality, greater mental well-being. So again, think about how that might apply to you, and I'll give you some strategies to at least think about for your children. So a couple here. The first one that I'm going to show you a video on is this case scenario. So those with mental health challenges are very good at jumping to the worst case scenario. As you could imagine, if they're thinking about what went wrong, what's going to go wrong, they're going to fail the maths exam, or they're not going to get an ATAR, they'll get an asterisk. Those sorts of catastrophic thinking and thoughts are obviously worst case, but to them, they're very real. So how do we help them to be more realistic with their thoughts? And this is a good technique.
Parents can guide children in managing anxiety and catastrophic thinking by practicing the worst, best, and most likely approach. Encourage them to consider 3 perspectives: the worst case scenario, the best case scenario, and the most likely case scenario. By considering the best case scenario, they tap into optimism and hope. Then by evaluating the most likely outcome, they ground themselves in reality and reason. This exercise helps balance their thoughts and emotions, reducing anxiety and promoting a more rational mindset. By engaging in more rational and balanced thinking, children can develop resilience, alleviate anxiety, and promote their mental well-being.
And another technique here for you to download and encourage to grab a pen and paper to make that more objective is a sensory engagement tool. So this one is another way to help ground children in reality. And it's, again, quite simple, but that's the benefit of it, which is we can all name things we can touch, see, hear, smell, and taste. So by going through that exercise, they're able to be more realistic with what actually is happening around them and be more attuned to the world and senses. Sensory engagement is very good, obviously, for promoting mental well-being because it grounds them back into that reality. And you don't necessarily have to do it in this order, but it's obviously much easier to touch 5 things rather than taste 5 things in that moment. The more important thing is to help them to regroup and not only get back into reality, but get into that present moment and focus on what actually they can, again, control and what can they see and touch and taste and smell, etc. So that's another thing that they can be doing in order to help with their mental well-being. So to summarise, hopefully you've come away with a few things that you've learnt. This is a summary that I have written up. So what did we learn today? That mental health is about being present, in control, and in touch with reality. And I just encourage you to keep thinking about those sorts of facets and how that can apply to your children. It's caused by nature and nurture. Obviously, you have a massive role in both of those to play, which I think is really why these webinars we're hoping will help you to help them. Mental health is important because it's a human right and a need, and it results in better outcomes, both academically, so not only higher achievements at school, but also throughout life, as we explored. And mental health can be promoted by helping children to be present, to be in control, and to be in touch with reality. And as I said, there are a couple of techniques we've already looked at. There's plenty more, and we will start looking at more specific ones for example, anxiety versus depression versus building self-esteem, things like that. But fundamentally, all of them are underpinned by these 3 dimensions. And I, again, would encourage you to think more about how you can apply these in even in small instances in day-to-day. Again, just a couple of questions. If you can, please scan the QR code and answer those for me. That would also help you to reflect on where you think your understanding is hopefully developed throughout the course of this webinar. But also, if you have extra questions and feedback, then I can respond to you that way and come back with some responses in the subsequent webinars. So I'll just give you some time to please do that. Okay, thank you for submitting those. Now we'll finalise today's session with some resources as to where to go now if you want some further resources that based on anything we've discussed today, but also use these throughout the webinar series going forward. So to start with, obviously some emergency contacts, always good to have on hand. I'm sure you're familiar with these, but these are there for you if you need them in an emergency. Obviously, there's plenty more resources online at Maximinds. You have 24/7 access here, real-time support, as I mentioned, linking specifically to different sorts of feelings and also helping you to identify feelings in the first place and what they might be feeling. All evidence-based, help you at real time at home, and there is the option to book a psychologist, but of course you've also got the KRB counselling team as a point of reference too. And finally, here are my contact details again for you if you would like to reach out, have any questions, any further feedback, and a link to the Maximinds parent page. Thank you everyone for joining for the first in the series on mental health and helping your children. I'm looking forward to the next 7 weeks, and if you have any questions, please reach out, and see you next week. Thank you.